It's a grey afternoon in Britain, early 1950s. School's over and nobody's asking where you're going. You step outside, pockets empty, hours ahead of you. Streets and fields were all fair game. And you knew you'd get back home when it's dark enough to matter. Here's the uncomfortable truth. That kind of childhood does not exist anymore. Not because the streets disappeared, but because childhood itself was redesigned. This is the story of how 1950s Britain raised the strongest generation in history. Childhood in post-war Britain had a level of freedom that feels almost unrecognizable now. When the school bell rang, children didn't move from one supervised activity to another. They disappeared into streets, alleys, fields, and bomb sites that still dotted towns and cities. These were not fenced off or labeled dangerous, they were simply part of the landscape. Piles of rubble, half-collapsed walls, and abandoned foundations became places to climb and explore. Play happened wherever space existed. Roads doubled as football pitches, games stopped only when a car appeared, and even then, only briefly. Scraped knees, bruised elbows, and torn clothes were expected outcomes, not emergencies. Injury was measured by whether someone could still walk home, not by how dramatic it looked. Freedom came with risk, and risk was accepted without debate. That environment produced independence out of necessity. Responsibility wasn't explained. It emerged naturally through experience. Food in the years following the war was not a certainty, but a carefully controlled resource. Ration books dictated how much could be eaten, when, and by whom. Sugar, butter, meat, eggs, and sweets were measured precisely. A single egg carried real value. Powdered milk replaced fresh. Bananas were so rare that some children encountered them for the first time as curiosities rather than food. This scarcity crossed class lines. It was not poverty in the modern sense, but national austerity that affected nearly everyone. Mothers became experts at stretching ingredients, transforming scraps into meals that could feed entire families. Bread pudding, dripping on toast, bubble and squeak, and stews bulked out with vegetables were staples born from necessity rather than choice. Treats were genuinely rare. Sweets were rationed until 1953, making queues for a single boiled sweet or sherbet lemon a memorable event. Chocolate was divided carefully among siblings. Fruit beyond apples appeared mainly at Christmas, when oranges felt exotic and special. Waste was unthinkable. Mouldy sections were cut away, leftovers were repurposed, carcasses were boiled for soup. Hunger shaped habits, expectations, and attitudes toward food for life. Wanting something did not mean having it. Patience and gratitude were not taught as values. They emerged naturally from living with less. British winters in the 1950s and 60s were unforgiving, and most homes offered little protection from them. Central heating was rare and usually reserved for the wealthy. For everyone else, warmth came from a single coal fire in the living room. The rest of the house remained cold, often bitterly so. Bedrooms were icy. Breath fogged the air in the mornings. Ice regularly formed on the inside of windows. Getting dressed was an exercise in endurance. Clothes went on beneath blankets because the air outside them felt unbearable. Hot water bottles weren't luxuries, they were survival tools. Fingers and toes suffered from constant cold, developing chilblains that burned and swelled painfully. There was no escaping winter indoors. School provided no relief. Classrooms were barely heated, if at all. Children sat in coats during lessons, gripping pencils with numb hands. Ancient radiators struggled uselessly against the cold. The winter of 1963 pushed this endurance to its limits, with snow lasting for months and temperatures that froze pipes and shut down transport. Still, school continued. Children walked through waist-high drifts without expectation of closure. Cold was not treated as exceptional, it was simply endured. Cigarettes were woven into everyday life in mid-century Britain in a way that is difficult to overstate. Smoking wasn't hidden, discouraged, or restricted to adults trying to be discreet. It was everywhere and performed openly. Parents smoked at the dinner table, teachers smoked in staff rooms and sometimes in classrooms. Doctors smoked during consultations. Television presenters and film stars held cigarettes as symbols of confidence, adulthood, and sophistication. The idea that smoke might be dangerous simply wasn't part of public thinking yet. Children grew up surrounded by it. Homes were thick with smoke. Buses, cinemas, cafes, and waiting rooms were saturated. Secondhand smoke wasn't a term anyone used, let alone feared. Buying cigarettes as a child was often easy. Corner shops sold individual cigarettes or small packets without much scrutiny, especially if a child claimed they were for dad. Vending machines stood unguarded in pubs and cafes, turning access into a matter of spare change rather than permission. By early adolescence, smoking had become common, even expected, among teenagers. It signaled maturity and rebellion at the same time. School toilets smelled permanently of tobacco, and some teachers quietly ignored older pupils smoking behind sheds or buildings. Health warnings existed by the late 1960s, but they arrived slowly and carried little urgency. The connection between smoking and long-term illness had not yet reshaped public behavior. This would later reveal itself as one of the most damaging norms of the era, shortening lives long before anyone understood the cost. Although the fighting had ended years earlier, the Second World War remained a constant presence in daily life. Cities still carried visible scars. Bomb sites interrupted neighborhoods. Buildings stood half-repaired. Shortages lingered. Adults spoke about the war casually, as something survived rather than something processed. For children born in the 1950s, this atmosphere shaped expectations before they even understood it. Hardship was normalized. There was no assumption that life should be easy, comfortable, or fair. Homes lacked modern conveniences. Food remained rationed into the early 1950s. Clothing was repaired, reused, and passed down. Waste felt morally wrong, not merely impractical. Parents who had lived through bombing, evacuation, and loss carried a quiet toughness that filtered into how children were raised. Emotional restraint was part of this inheritance. Complaints were discouraged. Fear was rarely indulged. Difficulties were met with the belief that things could always be worse, because recently they had been. War stories weren't always dramatic retellings. Often they were small references, dropped casually, reminding children that survival had once depended on far less than what they currently had. This created a particular mindset. Life was approached with caution, resilience, and a readiness to endure. Even as Britain slowly moved toward prosperity, the psychological weight of wartime Britain continued to shape childhood. Childhood did not stretch comfortably into the late teens for most families. Money pressures cut it short. By 11 or 12, many children were already working, not for extras or treats, but because households depended on the income. Paper rounds started before dawn. Heavy bags dragged through dark streets in all weather, followed by a full school day without complaint or adjustment. Saturday jobs were not optional experiences. They were contributions that mattered. Boys delivered groceries by bicycle, worked in butcher shops, assisted milkmen, or swept factory floors. Girls took care of younger siblings, cleaned houses, worked in corner shops, or helped neighbors who paid in coins and favors. This labor was not labeled exploitation. It was understood as responsibility. Families functioned as economic units, and every capable member played a role. The school leaving age remained 15 until the early 1970s, and many counted the days until they could leave. Apprenticeships began early, dropping teenagers into adult environments filled with noise, danger, and expectations far beyond their years. Factories, shipyards, mines, and construction sites relied on young workers who learned by doing, often without protection or training that would be considered acceptable today. Health and safety regulations barely existed, and risk was accepted as part of earning a living. Healthcare was free after the creation of the NHS, but medical care lagged far behind modern standards. Childhood illnesses that are now preventable or easily treated carried real danger. Polio frightened parents until vaccines arrived in the mid-1950s. Measles, mumps, whooping cough, diphtheria, and rubella swept through schools regularly, often infecting entire classes at once. Death and long-term complications were not rare outcomes. Hospitals lacked modern equipment and treatment. treatments. Antibiotics existed, but availability and understanding were limited. Medical decisions often relied on judgment rather than diagnostics. Pain management was basic at best. Dental care was particularly harsh. Drilling frequently happened with minimal anesthetic, and extractions were common. Rotten teeth were widespread due to sugar consumption, poor dental hygiene education, and limited access to preventative care. Mental health barely existed as a concept. Trauma was not discussed. Anxiety and depression were not diagnoses, but personal failings. Children were expected to cope quietly, regardless of circumstances. Emotional distress was met with discipline rather than support. Illness and pain were treated as facts of life rather than problems to be solved. Entertainment in mid-century Britain was simple, limited, and entirely dependent on imagination. Toys were not abundant and rarely disposable. Many were homemade, repaired repeatedly, or passed between siblings until they fell apart. Dolls had china faces and stitched clothes. Toy soldiers lost paint and limbs but stayed in circulation. Train sets were treasured possessions, carefully packed away and brought out on special occasions rather than scattered across floors. Television existed, but it was not constant. Early sets were small, black and white, and unreliable. Programming was limited and often ended early in the evening. Watching television was a shared activity, with families gathering together rather than isolating themselves in separate rooms. Radio remained just as important. Programs like children's storytelling hours and comedy shows fired imaginations far more than visuals ever could. Most play happened outdoors. Football, marbles, hopscotch, skipping ropes, conkers and card games required little more than space and time. Boredom was common, but it was not treated as a problem needing immediate correction. It forced creativity. Children invented games, set rules, argued, adapted, and learned social negotiation without adult intervention. Nothing relied on batteries or screens. Imagination filled the gaps left by material scarcity. Play developed problem-solving, patience, and cooperation naturally. In contrast to modern overstimulation, this slower, simpler form of entertainment shaped creativity in an amazing way. Authority in mid-century Britain was clear, visible, and rarely challenged. Adults did not negotiate with children. They instructed them. Obedience was expected instantly, without explanation or discussion. Respect was not framed as mutual understanding, but as a social requirement enforced by consequences. Children stood when adults entered rooms. They spoke when spoken to. Answering back was treated as defiance rather than expression. This authority extended far beyond parents and teachers. Police officers, bus conductors, shopkeepers, park keepers, and neighbours all held the right to correct children's behaviour. A child misbehaving in public could be disciplined by any adult nearby, with full confidence that parents would support the intervention rather than question it. Social boundaries were clearly defined, and everyone understood their place within them. Fear played a role, but so did predictability. Rules were simple and widely shared. Consequences followed reliably. There was little ambiguity about what was allowed and what was not. Modern ideas of children's autonomy or emotional expression had little presence. Behavior mattered more than feelings, and order mattered more than comfort. This system produced conformity and discipline, but it also suppressed curiosity and dissent. While it created structure and accountability, it left little room for challenge or change. Authority was not something to engage with, it was something to obey. Childhood operated on an assumption of independence rather than protection. Adults were present, but not constantly involved. Children were expected to manage themselves for long stretches of the day, navigating friendships, conflict, boredom, and danger without guidance. There were no scheduled playdates, no organized activities filling every afternoon, and no expectation that adults would intervene unless something truly serious occurred. Risk was treated as unavoidable rather than unacceptable. Falling, getting hurt, getting lost briefly, or learning the hard way were considered normal experiences. Parents did not track movements or demand updates. Trust replaced monitoring. Children learned responsibility not through instruction, but through consequences that arrived naturally when mistakes were made. There were no safety nets in the modern sense. Emotional reassurance was limited. Support existed, but it was practical rather than expressive. Problems were solved by adapting, enduring, or finding a workaround. Fear was rarely discussed, and anxiety was not something adults sought to remove from children's lives. Exposure to difficulty was seen as preparation rather than harm. This lack of supervision created resilience, but it also required maturity at a young age. Children learned to read situations, assess people, and handle pressure long before adulthood. They became self-reliant because there was little alternative. While this independence fostered confidence and adaptability, it also meant that vulnerability often went unnoticed. Strength was assumed and softness was rarely accommodated. Discipline in schools was strict, physical, and unquestioned. Corporal punishment was not hidden or controversial. It was institutionalized. Canes hung visibly in head teachers' offices, serving as constant reminders rather than empty threats. Punishment was swift and public enough to deter others. Pain was considered an effective teaching tool, not a moral dilemma. The phrase, "six of the best," carried real weight. Leather straps, wooden rulers, and gym shoes were accepted methods of correction. Parents supported these practices almost universally. A child punished at school often faced further punishment at home for bringing shame or trouble. Authority flowed in one direction, and challenging it only worsened consequences. Fear maintained order. Classrooms were quiet, structured, and obedient. Respect was enforced rather than earned. Teachers held unquestioned control, and mistakes carried immediate repercussions. Emotional context did not matter. Behavior mattered. Compliance mattered more. From a modern perspective, this system appears harsh and damaging, and in many cases it was. It discouraged curiosity and silenced dissent, yet it also created clear boundaries and a strong sense of accountability. Children understood exactly where limits lay and what happened when they crossed them. Discipline shaped behavior effectively, but often at the expense of emotional safety, leaving long-term effects that would only be recognized decades later. Leaving school did not mark a gentle transition into adulthood. It was abrupt and unforgiving. With the school leaving age set at 15 for much of the period, many teenagers stepped directly into full-time work environments designed for adults, not young bodies or developing minds. Apprenticeships promised skills and security, but they also exposed teenagers to noise, danger, and responsibility far beyond their years. Factories, shipyards, coal mines, and building sites relied heavily on young labour. Training was informal and often minimal. Safety equipment was limited or non-existent. Mistakes carried serious consequences, and injuries were treated as unfortunate but expected. Lost fingers, crushed limbs, and long-term health damage were common enough to be unremarkable. Complaints rarely went far, and compensation culture had not yet taken hold. Working conditions were harsh, hours were long, and expectations were rigid. Showing weakness invited ridicule. Quitting was rarely an option, as families depended on wages and opportunities were scarce. Adult hierarchies ruled workplaces, and young workers learned quickly to keep their heads down and endure. This early immersion accelerated maturity. Teenagers learned discipline, endurance, and responsibility at speed. At the same time, it robbed many of a protected adolescence. Childhood ended not because of choice, but because economic reality demanded it. Growing up left little room for error. Childhood moved quickly, not because anyone rushed it deliberately, but because circumstances demanded competence early. There was no extended buffer between dependence and responsibility. Mistakes carried real consequences, and recovery often depended on adapting rather than being rescued. Safety nets, as they are understood today, barely existed. Children were expected to cope with situations that would now trigger adult intervention. Navigating public transport alone, managing money, handling conflict, and dealing with physical risk were treated as normal expectations rather than milestones. Failure was not cushioned. If something went wrong, the lesson was learned immediately and often uncomfortably. This environment rewarded awareness and self-control. Hesitation and naivety carried penalties. Maturity arrived not through guidance but through necessity. Emotional readiness mattered less than functional capability. The ability to manage daily life took priority over psychological development. As a result, many learned resilience early, but they also learned to suppress uncertainty and fear. Growing up happened quickly because there was no alternative. Respect was not negotiated or discussed. It was enforced through routine, hierarchy, and the certainty of consequences. Adults did not attempt to persuade children to behave well. They expected it. Authority rested on age, position, and social role, not on explanation or emotional connection. Fear played a role, but predictability mattered just as much. Everyone knew where the boundaries were and what happened when they were crossed. Daily life reinforced this structure constantly. Children stood when adults entered a room. Instructions were followed immediately. Tone mattered. Body language mattered. Answering back was treated as disrespect rather than self-expression. Discipline was swift enough that lessons were rarely forgotten. Over time, behavior became automatic, shaped by habit rather than reflection. Routine strengthened this system. School schedules, work hours, household rules, and social expectations created a rhythm that left little room for challenge. Respect was demonstrated through compliance and restraint. Those who failed to conform learned quickly that defiance brought discomfort. This approach produced order and reliability. People understood expectations and adjusted accordingly. At the same time, it discouraged questioning and emotional openness. What part of growing up in the 50s do you miss the most? Let us know in the comments below. If you learned something new today, make sure to subscribe to the channel. See you in the